And now we have Schweitzers talking.
All right, come on, guys, come on. Oh, well, there's a few folks here that wasn't sure. It is awfully early in the morning. I'm wondering if these folks are open. I wonder if they're awake enough to laugh.
I'm sure they have.
You know, we shouldn't assume anything, right, about this audience. They do look perky, and we're perky. Yeah.
Some perkier than others.
So, good morning. It's great of you to be here at this early hour. What I promised for this next 35 minutes was an entertaining reader's theater based on Schweitzer's stories. Now, whether it's entertaining or not to you, that's to yet be decided. And you'll learn more about the process of putting this together as we present. So I thought maybe as a good preliminary, it would be good for you all to know just a little bit about who we are. And so we're just going to go down and say our names and a few sentences about ourselves.
I'm Tschetter. I grew up in Freeman, South Dakota. I attended Bethel College, and now I am a Newton resident. At the start of this rehearsal process, I went in thinking I was 25% Schweitzer, and after talking more with my extended family, I only am 1/16. But I still made the cut.
You're a friend.
I'm Karin Kaufman Wall. I also have grown up in Freeman, South Dakota, and for anybody that knows Freeman, let me clarify that I'm from East Freeman. And I also attended Bethel College, and I am now a resident of North Newton, Kansas. And I am proud to say that I am 100% Schweitzer.
Ooh, I do not know what my percentage of Schweitzer is, but since you're dividing it up into 16ths, I'll say I'm 15/16. All right. My name is John McCabe-Juhnke, and I was born and raised in rural Mound Ridge. That's where we are. And spent most of my life in North Newton, Kansas, teaching at Bethel College.
I'm Leann Toews. I spent my childhood in Pretty Prairie, and now, it's a picture. And now I live in front of Gossel, and I'm in a mixed marriage. My husband is Lone German, but I'm 100% Schweitzer.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Julianna Kaufman. Some of you may remember me as Julianna Schrag, which I was very recently. I grew up in rural Gossel. I don't know whether in front or behind. In front, yeah. And I'm a Newton resident now. According to the all-knowing Grandpa Dale Schrag, whose seminar, by the way, I'm sure you all are attending right after.
Just stay.
Just stay put. I'm 3/4 Schweitzer, so I am significantly Schweitzer. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Jerod Kaufman. I grew up in rural Mound Ridge as well. I live in Newton with my wife Julianna, and I believe I'm a half Schweitzer at last check, but I could be wrong. You can call me out. Is that right? Yeah, that's close enough. 25. Okay, 25.
Somewhere, you know, not quite yet a friend, but all right. Well, I do need to share with the audience a little secret that we know here, and that is that,
well, here, so 25 years ago, everyone, John wrote the Reader's Theater script for the 125th year celebration.
And the title was Reaping the Harvest, Stories of Struggle, Faith, and Celebration.
oh yeah, so both of those things are true. But let's do a little rough survey because I'm interested to know how many of you out there were at the Schweitzer celebration 25 years ago in 1999. Raise your hands. Well, look there.
Awesome.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Now keep your hands up. Keep them up if you remember the Reader's Theater.
Leann.
Well, it was pretty forgettable. John showed us the introduction to the script at our first meeting, and we were going, yikes!
Yes, yikes, is right. When I found that old script in preparation to do this one, I was like, it's a little cringe-worthy.
But shouldn't we just share a line or two?
No.
See what they say.
Our ancestors tilled the ground, planted the seeds, and watched as the fields of tender green transformed seemingly overnight into golden waves of grain.
All right. Styles change. And this time, no overly earnest title. Just 2 words, Schweitzers talking.
Hey, that's a ripoff from the movie Women Talking.
Oh, yes, it is another overly earnest Mennonite story. And I think Schweitzers Talking suggests the perfect title because it sounds like casual conversation. You know, the kind of stuff we hear while sitting around at a family gathering or sitting with friends.
So not so much earnest as it is every day.
Right, and in fact, a good chunk of the stories that I used in this script originated in everyday conversations. Some are from transcripts of recorded interviews I did with Schweitzer folks a while back.
When he was a grad student.
Yeah, more than a while back.
And other students are from recordings of family reunions.
Also, we are indebted to Casey Adams and Brian Adams for a few stories.
Yes, we are. Casey and or Brian, are you here so we could acknowledge you? Okay, maybe they were wise and decided on the 12:30 performance. Anyway, they shared with me the archive of stories that they collected for a book published especially for this celebration. The book is called A Collection of Stories Preserving Our Mennonite Heritage. So thank you, Brian and Casey, wherever you are.
And if you're interested in reading more, copies of the book will be for sale and available at the book table.
And of course, as we met and rehearsed and talked about these stories, a few of our own stories bubbled up and they might have made their way into the script.
So what you're hearing today is a sort of cross-generational conversation of mostly entertaining stories clustered around common themes.
Church and community, life on the farm, gender roles.
Local eccentrics, frugality, Schweitzer dialect.
Hey,
Schweitzer dialect.
Okay. And the occasional off-color joke.
Consider that your trigger warning.
as it turns out, elements of Swiss Bohemian identity, some of that has endured through generations, and some of it, well, see for yourself as we present Schweitzers Talking.
When the Schweitzers came, they came on two ships, the city of Richmond and the city of Chester. Now, we all know they had a difficult time coming across the ocean, but how rough was it? What were their fears? And what were their concerns?
Well, the Hutterites have a good story that illustrates how frightened our people were of the water. You know, they'd never seen the ocean before. From their home in Russia, they were as far from the ocean as we are right here. They'd heard these harrowing stories of travel on the ocean, and they were terribly frightened.
Oh, yes, and one Hutterite was a particular nervous Nelly, and every time the wind came up and fluttered the sea just a little bit, he was so agitated that he would rush over to the captain immediately and say,
My goodness, are we going to drown? Are we in danger? Am I going to die?
Well, the captain soon saw that he was going to have to put up with this every day. And of course, he didn't like that prospect at all. So he called this nervous hooter to his side.
Now look, we haven't been in any danger since we sailed. But if we do get into danger, I'll have to give my full attention to the duties at hand. So if you come up here and distract me with your questions, you're going to cause me to make a mistake that could really, really be dangerous. So if you really want to know if we're in trouble, you'll go down to the boiler room where those fellas are stoking the furnaces. Now, they've sailed the 7 oceans of the world, and they know instinctively whether or not it's bad. But I must caution you, however, they're a salty bunch of fellas, and they swear terribly. But that's to your advantage, because once they stop swearing, you'll know it's really serious.
Well, next day, another little breeze came up and the water was ruffled, and this nervous widower went quickly down to the stoker room.
It didn't take long, and he came back ashen face, and his hands were folded.
And everyone looked at him to see what the situation was. He raised his eyes heavenward and said,
Gott sei Dank, sie blühen noch.
"Praise the Lord, they're still swearing."
Typical hooder, don't you think? So my great-grandmother Anna was one that actually came over on the city of Richmond. When I was a senior in high school, great-grandma came to live with us for about 6 weeks or so. It was a highlight for me. She was about 94 years old at the time and did not have a tooth in her mouth. Store-bought teeth didn't work to eat, and she was never too much into vanity. She wore that Schweitzers Tracht mit Kopftuch, the black dress with the black scarf pulled down to cover the wart on one eye, black high-top shoes. As a kid growing up, I knew 2 things. One, you always spoke German to Grandma because, well, God only speaks German. And 2, you always shook hands with her. Now, you had to remove any rings because the pain of that handshake made a lasting impression. She got her strength from milking cows, which she continued to do well into her 80s. Her hands were so big and strong. She told us that when she was a little girl in Russia, she would milk all 4 faucets on the cow at the same time. In fact, her reputation for milking was so well known that outsiders would come and watch her and give her coins.
What a great way to make a buck.
Moolah.
Now, I have a story. You have a story. No, I have a story. Where are we in the script? Talking about family. I remember once when we were at Uncle Bill's, and there was you had a little kind of a little round building there south of the house. Anyway, we were there for dinner on one Sunday, and in the afternoon we was all playing around that building, and we were looking up, and I couldn't figure out what you all were doing. I goes over and I kind of sticks my head in. I couldn't see anything. And then I looked up and there was a turkey sitting on the rafters up there. That old turkey sitting there, and I was sort of standing and looking with my mouth open. What that turkey did to me! It was all over my glasses and my face and the front of my shirt, and gosh, I wanted to puke, but I couldn't, and then I thought I was going to die, and later I was afraid I wouldn't die. Finally, I just went over to the old stock tank and got cleaned up. And to this day, when I eat turkey, I just kind of stop and think, that serves you right, you old rascal.
Now, I have a story about my Uncle John R. and my dad. See, this one time, Orlin and Lou were on a trip together with Uncle John and Aunt Cora, and nature called, and Orlin had to go so terribly bad, and there wasn't a bathroom anywhere in sight, and so they stopped the car, and he ran into a cornfield, pulled down his pants, and squatted down to do his business. And in the meantime, John R. snuck out to the field and started barking like a dog. And Orlin was so scared that he ran out of the field with his pants down, and they said John R. laughed for the next 100 miles.
I never talked to John R. about this, but my dad told me, you ask him about it, and he'll give a great big loud laugh. And he did. Then I asked him for a little bit more detail, and he said for him the funny thing was Uncle Orland pants around his ankles, and he had his back arched, like maybe if he arched a little bit too much, that dog couldn't get to him. And he said when he barked, Orland said, and away he went.
So I have a story about my grandpa, Jacob P. Creighton.
Oh yes, isn't he the one they call Red Jake?
Red Jake.
Oh yes, because he had a red beard.
Oh.
Well, he became a successful businessman, running the hardware store. So when he was older, he had accumulated a fair bit of farmland. And one night, he was out with some of the farmers in the area, and there was some good partying. So today we would call it, he was a bit overserved. And the next day, the word had got out that Red Jake got snookered into buying a quarter section of land that was mostly wasteland and not really good for farming. But it turned out that oil was discovered on that land, and that started the oil boom in McPherson County.
Oh, here's another one. Apparently, Red Jake Crable was notorious for his chewing tobacco habit. You see, my grandfather chewed tobacco occasionally, but he kept this fact a secret from Grandma. So one day the phone rang, and Grandma answered. The caller wanted to talk to Grandpa, who was working outside. And Grandpa happened to be chewing tobacco at the moment, so he spit out the chew, went in to answer the phone, and then went back outside. And shortly after, Red Jake called to speak to Grandpa. So Grandma called him in again, and as she handed him the phone, she said, "That Red Jake chews so much tobacco you can smell it over the phone."
Talking about notorious characters, the Bishop Bear was another interesting fellow.
Oh yes, I remember him. He was a door-to-door salesman who drove around in his buggy. And one of the things he did was peddle his books.
Oh, Fischer, yes, German for books, and Bear, that was the guy's last name.
But he also had devotional type things. Well, he just made a run of the community, from house to house. And wherever he landed in the evening, that's where he slept. His horse was taken care of in the barn. Somebody once asked him about going where you're not invited, and he said in German, "They didn't tell me not to come."
Well, I know that he did spend a lot of nights at different people's houses. I heard that he was at this Herman Weedle's. They had a lot of children, and they only lived in a 4-room house, so he'd go there and stay all night. Well, then he'd bring his dirty clothes, and they'd have to wash them, and of course, you know how much wash that would be. Well, they got a little tired of it, and so one time when he came, they took his underwear, and they starched it. And that was the last time he ever brought her.
So if Herman Weedles had a whole bunch of kids, wouldn't a brother or two be available to help with the laundry?
Oh, no, the men, they were out in the field.
Yeah, greasing the combine and cutting the wheat.
They were fixing fence and working in the barn.
Talking about men in the fields, cutting wheat, and in the barn. Here's my story of helping my dad in the barn. Well, the strange thing is, why my dad ever did it. Because he was a fairly astute man, and his plan to get all the sheep in the barn at one time and trim their hooves didn't have a snowball's chance from the beginning. One at a time with his pocket knife, that's how he did it. It was about, I don't know, I think I was 12 years old and my sister Joanne was 2 years old. And the idea was that Joanne and I would stand at the open barn door. And then Dad, after he finished with the ewe, he'd bring it over to the door and we'd get out of the way and let them out one at a time. Well, you know how sheep like to stay together. And some of the time they didn't even go out. So he'd bring them, and even if we stepped aside, they wouldn't go out. No, they wanted to be with the group. So nothing about this had the potential for working. I think actually only one went out, maybe two. And then one came out, and all the others, she decided, hey, this looks like a heck of a good idea. And they came, and you know, over the years, the barn floor had built up with dirt and mist and whatever, and so that when you were going out of the barn, you were going downhill. And if you know anything about sheep, well, they were coming down at an angle, and they started to run, and they're going to start to jump. And instantly, I had this vision of a big old ewe just smacking me in the head. And I said, heck with this, and I turned and I ran. And then I turned back and I looked. And there was Joanne with two arms around a ewe on each hand, trying to hold them back. I think at that point, Dad just gave up on the whole thing. And then he turned and looked at me and said, well, I guess the only real boy I ever had is my daughter.
Wow. So, okay, so talking about cutting wheat.
No, wait. Talking about cutting wheat.
Oh yes, talking about cutting wheat. The whole year was built around harvest.
And when harvest time came, your nervous energy just went up several notches, and you could put in the longest days, and everything had to revolve around it.
And today, with all the harvest equipment we have, we can get harvest over in a hurry, but tensions run almost higher than before.
Well, I once heard of a businessman in McPherson who said he's scared of three things:
Cancer,
tornadoes,
and the Mennonites in harvest.
Well, I remember once when the binder broke down. And so, you know, they were trying to hurry and you're in this one.
Am I?
Yes?
Is it okay for me to talk?
Please. Okay. So anyway, the binder broke down and they were trying to, you know, hurry and fix it, and then it started to thunder. And my brother said,
That's the thunder for you.
and Dad was just furious. I think Dad just gave him a light tap on the head with the wrench in his hand.
Well, I heard the story that they were thrashing over at Ben Zerger's place, and apparently the machine broke down, and some guy yelled, "Hallelujah, the machine is zerbrochen." And the owner took a very dim view of that. That guy got a thrashing you wouldn't believe.
Now, Dan W. Gehring had a good story about harvest. They called him Dictionary Dan with his knowledge, with his vocabulary, and so on. Anyway, he said one year the wheat crop was so poor it hardly paid to combine. It was terrible, just terrible. So I made a round with the combine, stopped and looked around, and nothing in the bin. So I made another round, stopped and looked, and still nothing in the bin. So when I went around the third time, I turned back to see what was going on. And don't you know that 2 sparrows were back there eating the grain just as fast as it was coming?
Yes, that sounds like Dan W. Oh, and do you remember that Dan would sometimes date girls that were a little bit on the plump side? So he got this reputation. Someone asked him, well, why do you do that? And he says, well, when I tell them a joke, there's more of them to laugh.
Well, talking about dating, you know when the telephones first came in, we had those party lines, and sometimes that could lead to problems. Well, my dad-in-law told the story over and over and over, but anyway, it was about this really bashful fellow who just didn't have the nerve to propose face to face. So he got this idea. He was going to propose over the telephone. So he called her up and asked her to marry him, and 15 girls said
Yes!
I doubt that many guys were concerned about being romantic in those days.
Do you think they're any better at it now?
Really?
My cousin told a story about when she and her husband were flying somewhere. Maybe it was Hawaii even, I don't know. But when they were in the airplane, she turned to her husband and said, "Oh, isn't this romantic? And he turned to look at her and said,
You have lipstick on your teeth.
My dad told a story about when he and Harold were little boys and rode along on a date to Uncle Rich when he was courting Lizzie. Well, they were all going to the ball game, and Rich had to take the younger boys with him because, of course, there was only one car. Well, so after the game, there's Dad and Harold in the back seat and Richard and Lizzie in the front. And Richard wanted to drop Lizzie off first. Well, Dad says it was because he was too cheap to use the gas to drop them off and then come back and take her home.
That sounds about
So
right.
he took her home, and he went into the house, and he left the boys out in the car. And he says, after a long, long time, they started honking the horn. And Rich came boiling out of there. But they felt it was merited because it was cold out there, and they just didn't know if he was going to be in there all night or what. But honking the horn, that'll get him out every time.
Of course. And they had to take the younger boys, right? Because that was the least expensive way to get everyone to the ball.
Oh yes, Schweitzers are known for being frugal.
no, you mean cheap.
Well, they used to call some of us pinchers.
Pinchers.
We have pretty prairie people. You've never heard of a pincher?
Don't you know what pinchers are?
John.
Pretty prairie, those are the
They
pinchers.
used to pinch pennies, I heard.
Pinch pennies. I never heard why they were called pinchers. I just knew they were.
Yeah, when you date, you go 60 miles, to pinch together, to get a date. And there were a few guys that went, and they said it was worth every mile.
Talking about frugality, you know what the philosophy is. He who wastes not, wants not. The first vehicle I owned was a 1925 Model T two-door touring without a top, just magneto. You always had to crank it. But for tires, I'd go to Uncle Henry's, who usually had some throwaway tires out in the backyard, behind the shed. And they drove Fords, and the tires fit. And I'd take a tire that was blown out, but had like the least amount of damage, but obviously a bulge. And then I'd take another tire that was really ripped up, and you could just peel the linings out of there. And then you'd have an inner tube that was patched like 10 different times, and you'd put it on that little thing, and it would do about 40 miles an hour. And it bounces you all over the place, and the radiator leaked. So I'd drive from Mound Bridge to Heston, and then add water to get to Newton.
Okay, I have one for you. One afternoon, I went to visit my dad. I tried to go periodically and check on him. He had been at Kimberly Bethel. And when I got there, he said,
Hey, I need to show you something.
and I said, well, what? So he pulls off his Birks, and he takes his sock off. His fashion sense was way ahead of his time with Birks and socks. But I said, Dad, what happened? Did you drop something on this? And he started laughing and said,
No, I had a hole in my sock. So rather than get another pair, I decided to take a magic marker and color my toe black so no one would notice the hole.
Here's another one. Most of you know Waldo Kaufman. He was a successful pastor at Lehigh for many
he
years.
was a pincher.
Oh, he was? Okay, well, anyway, he has two cars, as most of us know. One of them is a new car that's been new for about 6 years. And the other one is an old car, and it's been old for at least 15 years. But anyway, he was out at Lehigh, and this old car broke down. So he was going to go to the mechanic over there in Lehigh, and he was a little anxious about whether this guy he didn't know him, and he'd charge him too much. And so he went in and he said, well, my name is Waldo Kaufman, and I'm just a poor pastor over here in Lehigh. And the mechanic looked at him and said, yeah, I know, I heard you once.
Well, it makes sense that stories about preachers would circulate among folks in these small Schweitzer communities because for several generations, church life was the center of all social life.
And talking about preachers, the Johannesthal Church in Freeman invited Reverend Ferdinand Grilch from Yankton to come up and be their speaker at the Harvest Mission Festival. Well, there they were. The little boys were on one side and the little girls were on the other. Well, during the Sunday school hour, Reverend Grilsch talked to them.
About der Hirt und die Schaf.
The sheep and the good shepherd. And for an hour, he was telling them about the sheep and the shepherd.
And he had everyone's attention.
And when the Sunday school hour was over, Reverend Grilsch felt very satisfied with himself. And he was going to show those parents just how he could teach these impressionable young kids by rote. And then he said, now if you are the sheep,
Dir sind die Schaf, was bin ich?
you are the sheep, what am I? And of course, every little hand went up and the Reverend Grilsch just beamed. And he pointed to the little girl and he told her that she should stand up and face the parents who were sitting way in the pews in the back.
Und sage es laut und deutlich.
Say it loud and clear.
Dir sind die Schaf, was bin ich?
And she threw her head back, and at the top of her voice, she bellowed out, "Der Buck! The buck!"
Oh, yes. The punchline had to be in German.
Oh, of course. The German language was central to the lives of second and third generation Schweitzers. It was the language of the church.
Well, the old timers would point to their Bibles and say, God spoke German. Well, look here in my Bible. God says to Adam, Adam, wo bist du?
And the Schweitzer dialect, well, that was the language of the home.
And the barn. And of more than a few punchlines.
Oh, yes, and so here's one. In the Hopefield Church, it was a small church, and most everybody who could carry a tune would join the choir. Well, there was this John Strauss there who was somewhat the butt of a lot of stories because he was just about the homeliest person that nature ever created. And he couldn't sing very well, but he'd try it. Well, we had a cantata. And at the rehearsal, obviously, it was a time when we had the seating arrangements made, but John Strauss wasn't there. So then the time came for the rendition, and he was there, and he walked up and he said, "Where do I sit?" And at the time, Ed P. Gearing was still alive, and so he asked Ed P., "Now where do I sit?" And Ed P. said, "Das weiß nur der Gott und die Neuenschwander." Now, Neuenschwander was a preacher. That only God and Neuenschwander where you're going to sit.
Was that?
Well, talking about the Schweitzer dialect, just the other day, I was thinking about now, I don't know which of Uncle Chris S. Gearing's boys it was, but the prayer at breakfast was always, Abba, Liebe, Vater, Amen. God, our loving Father, Amen. Well, they had Leberwurst for breakfast, and this little boy says, Abba, Liebe, Leberwurst, Amen. He was anxious for that Leberwurst.
No, so I heard a story about a guy who was hauling some hogs to Halstead with a lumber wagon. Maybe you know this one. Anyways, so he's riding along the wagon. It's a pretty good stretch. What is it, 14 or 15 miles to Halstead from Mound Ridge or so?
I think that's about right.
Yeah, so this was before asphalt and it was really bumpy. So he was bumping along with his team of horses and he didn't have a cushion on his seat and it got tiresome and I guess he got bored. And so he got the bright idea that he was going to stop at the next farmhouse and try to buy or borrow a pillow to sit on. And so he went to the door and a woman answered. And of course, she wasn't German, and he was so German that he didn't know all of the English words. Now, the German word for pillow is Kissa. But here he comes, and here's this English woman comes to the door, and he's got this problem, right? So he says, I need a Kissa. Can you give me a Kissa? And she backs off and thinks, what kind of a bold guy is this, right? And so he caught on that wasn't quite the right word to say, right? So he says, no, 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 not a kiss here, a kiss there.
Oh,
We went there.
talking about the nether regions.
Yes.
Oh, but it's a really short story, I promise. It's cute. It's about potty training.
Ah, what's more universal? Let him tell it.
No, I think our time is up.
It's a new story. No German. I heard it last year.
For the newest generation of Schweitzers.
Okay, but this has to be the last story. Dale Schraub's getting nervous over here.
So, a cousin of mine recently told the story at a family reunion. I guess his kids were visiting and they had this little boy that they were potty training. So Sarah, the boy's mom, thinks she's got it all under control. But you know, it's, okay, Simon, do you need to poop? No. Okay, now are you sure you don't need to poop? No, don't need to poop. Now, I'm gonna be pretty upset if you do poop in your pants. No, I don't have to go. And it was time he learned, and he was almost 3 by then, and so it's all settled, and he poops his pants. And that's what put Sarah over the edge, and she launched into a bit of a shinder, and
No German.
a scolding, a lecture, a rah, 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 rah. And at the end, she says, Simon, I just need to tell you, I'm really disappointed in you. And he said, Mommy, I'm disappointed you're still talking.
Yes, did you hear Leann? Yeah, take that again. Wisdom from the mouth of babes.
Yes, stop talking.
Okay. All right. We have reached the end. No more Schweitzers talking.